Zach Servideo here from Boston Speaks Up. I'm here with an old friend of mine, Mike Farber of GreenStory. Hey, Mike.
Hey, how are you, man?
I'm doing really well. It was a pleasure just getting a chance to jam with you for like 15 minutes pre-call. I can't remember the last time it was that we chatted, but there were so many questions I never asked you in the past that I'll get to ask today, learning a bit more about you, but also a bit more what you're up to with GreenStory. And just to begin there, why don't you share with listeners what you're up to today?
Yeah. So first, Zach, thank you so much. Thanks for having me on the pod. Um, Green Story is really looking at what's happening around climate, and my business partner, Megan Mayu Bergman, and I sort of thought about what we could do to help with regards to solving the climate crisis. And we took a very candid look at sort of like what is needed in the market and what are our skill sets. And Megan and I are both storytellers. And if you look at a lot of what climate facing organizations are grappling with, many times they're like crushing the tech and they're sort of putting out really interesting products. And they might even be making a lot of progress with regards to becoming profitable. Um, but they have no idea how to talk about themselves. And they certainly don't know how to do it in a way that is compelling to the different audiences that they're trying to get to do something about the climate crisis. So Megan and I launched this company about a year ago. We're having a phenomenal time. We're working with this really great base of clients, and it's really been just a wonderful, positive experience where we feel like we're making an impact.
Amazing. I'm curious just to double click on maybe an amazing client or two now. Just like, is there one that maybe we are or really should be familiar with? And what you shared really resonates with me. I think oftentimes the some of the most important things in the world just are really good, carefully thought out and sort of well told stories away from impressing upon the right audience.
Yeah,
It's valuable, the valuable messages that it has to bring to the world. So
sure.
want to share what some of those sort of messages and stories are?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me sort of start up and then
Yeah,
come down a little bit, just a
yeah,
little bit of
yeah,
context for
yeah.
the kind of companies and organizations we work with. So first off, Green Story is looking to work with any company or organization that is looking to address the climate crisis. Um, a lot of the companies that we've worked with so far are startups. And if you sort of look at the startup ecosystem, there is a tremendous amount of company creation that's happening around climate. And there's a million reasons that that's happening, and we can talk about that in a bit. Um, but then when you also think about story, many times it's these smaller startup companies that don't necessarily have the internal resources to have somebody who can help them craft those stories. And they know they have different audiences that they're trying to go after. Many cases, it's an investor audience where maybe they're trying to get their first serious Series A round or maybe even a seed round. But they also want to, attract employees and potential business partners and things like that. Um, so that's a long-winded windup to sort of contextualize sort of our first really group of clients has been very focused sort of in the startup world. And I'll highlight one company called Fleet Robotics. Um, Another thing that's happening in climate, and this is why there's so much company creation that's happening, is that there are opportunities across virtually every sector of the economy for companies to create something that has some sort of environmental focus. Fleet Robotics is focused on shipping. So think about these big old ships that come out of the harbor, and there are tons and tons and tons. And if you just sort of sit back for a minute, think about how much fuel they consume. And they don't just use fuel, they use some of the nastiest, dirtiest fuel out there.
Huh.
So Fleet has these robots, these little robots. Think about like a Roomba on steroids that's super ruggedized, that can be out there in bad weather, and they continually clean the ship hull. And what that means is it reduces the drag of the cargo ship. So
Hmm.
it's much more efficient and burns less fuel.
No, that's great.
And I got to tell you, man, there is a million examples of this kind of company happening out there. There's
That's
so
cool.
much innovation happening around climate.
What's cool about that is A, what they're doing, and B, the fact that they've partnered with you, because I'm doing a time check here on making little notes on highlights, and that was under 60 seconds right there. That was a pretty tight elevator pitch for Fleet Robotics. That's great. How long have they been in business? Are they out of Boston? I mean, you've got, you're from Vermont. You've spent some time in SF, but you're a Boston guy. You're living in Concord now. Um, you're open to do business everywhere. Obviously, Greentown Labs is here. We can talk a little bit about your role as sort of an advisor in your relationship with Greentown Labs. Are you seeing that like there is an overabundance of companies addressing the climate crisis here in Boston, as it seems it is? Our team at Value Creation Labs is going to be looking into the climate sector this summer, along with on behalf of New England Venture Capital Association and Fidelity, as I mentioned to you before the call. And I love the aperture view you gave us, which is the one we tend to look at. Like we looked at it similarly with AI. It's like AI can have an impact on every sector. All these same sectors too can think about like where are areas or components of our business where we can make changes, modifications, or introduce products or solutions to have a positive impact on the climate, is what I took away
Mm-hmm,
from you, which is great. Are you
mm-hmm.
are you feeling like Boston is an ideal place for you to build GreenStory?
Absolutely. Um, there's there's a number of reasons, but particularly with regards to what I would call like hard tech, climate tech stuff, like Boston's the best. I mean, there's no doubt about it, because part of what you need is you need the big brains, right? So, like using Greentown as an example, you have all these, PhD postgrads from MIT and Harvard and schools that come and want to take a company from sort of science experiment or something they have in the lab to actually developing an actual company. So you've got that like hard science piece, but then you also have the ecosystem that could support it. So you have entrepreneurs who have done this before. You have investors. You have a community like Greentown, which is wildly unique in the world, in the sense that you can just sort of walk in, Zach and Mike can create a company, and we can go to Greentown and have lab space, which is like
Mm-hmm.
impossible to find, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you put all that together and it becomes a bit of a flywheel. Um, and then I'm sure we're going to talk about policy later in the
Yeah.
pod, but policy is a big piece of it too. And Massachusetts is a very leading edge with regards to policy creation that encourages people to create these hard climate tech companies here in the Boston area.
Amazing. Thank you. Yeah, we'll dig into policy and some other factors later that sort of lead to the industry itself kind of really proliferating, but in particular in Boston and the New England region. Let's take a little bit of step back in time though. This is a
Okay.
question I don't know if I don't think I ever asked this of you when we were out there playing Schwartz softball together in 2007, 8, 9. Where'd you grow up? What was your childhood like?
Yeah, so I'm a Pennsylvania kid. So I grew up in
Yeah.
Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which probably most of your listeners and viewers have only visited coming in through an interstate from like on their way from Boston to
Yep.
DC or something.
Yep.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's also the state capital that a lot of people get wrong. Everyone's like, oh, the capital of Pennsylvania is definitely Philly. Oh, it's not. Then
Right.
it's Pittsburgh.
That's
It's like
Pittsburgh.
it's Pittsburgh, right? No, it's Harrisburg. So so I grew up in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Um, Grew up with a single mom who is the hero of my life. She's an amazing woman. Um, and I grew up with a brother, and we were super tight. Um, One of the things that happens, I'm not sure where you grew up. I know you grew up around here, but one of the things that
Yeah.
happens for a lot of
Yeah.
people when they grow up in a small town is like they want out, like as soon as they can get out. And that was definitely my mindset. So, in middle school and high school, I knew that college was going to be sort of my ticket out.
Yep.
And I didn't want to go to Penn State, though it's an amazing school. And I really wanted to come to Boston. So I just started putting the pieces together, working really hard. I had a paper route, and I did this thing when I was in, right?
Same.
I love
Yeah,
the paper route. It
me
was
too.
great. It,
I
it
know.
was great.
Yeah. Speaking of college, the paper Lawrence Eagle Tribune, because I grew up in Methuen.
Yeah.
I think I earned like a $1,500 scholarship that bought my laptop for college. Being a paper boy, it qualified for me for a scholarship.
Zach, you're going to
Yeah,
love this story. So
yeah.
I got a scholarship story. Basically, what happened was I hit high school and I had an evening route with Saturday and Sunday mornings.
Yep.
And when you get to high school, as you know, you're super busy with all these after
Hmm.
school activities and sports and stuff like that. So I couldn't really pitch the papers anymore, but I wanted to be eligible for the scholarship.
Yep.
So in essence, I hired a subcontractor and I got
There you
like this
go.
10-year-old kid to deliver papers like Monday through Friday. And then I still did Saturday, Sunday,
Yep.
and was able to get that scholarship
Smart.
uh, to help
Yeah.
me go to Boston College, which is where I went undergrad.
Smart. I didn't go the subcon. That's an entrepreneurial route that you went right there. We did it by committee, our family, and it
Oh,
became
nice.
such a. So my brother and sister are like each younger than me, so they all participated in the route, but it became such a like simple, 50 plus paper route, good extra scratch for the family that my dad
Yeah.
like held on to the paper route after we all were gone.
Oh, that's
Like
awesome.
he
So
like
was he
kept
one of
doing
these
the
guys who
paper
was
route.
like driving down the street, just like chucking it?
Oh yeah, he'd drive. Yeah, he'd drive with his old Chevy Trailblazer, and he'd just be, just hucking papers. Just keep it. He kept going. He was like the oldest paper boy in the city.
That's awesome. I love the
Yeah,
scrappiness. That's so cool.
yeah. So then it was Boston College like your top choice in Boston? Did you look at like there's obviously a ton of great schools to pick from, but did you visit Chestnut Hill and you're like, oh hell yeah, like this is where I'm going? I just got to get
I
in because it's not an easy school to get into.
It's not an easy school to get into. I actually did not visit it. We didn't do a lot of traveling growing up.
Yeah,
So, I visited Penn State. I visited like maybe the
yeah,
schools around Harrisburg, but like
yeah.
Boston would have been a really big trip. But I knew I wanted to go there. Um, and it was definitely my top choice. So I was fortunate to get into a number of schools. Um, BC, I wanted to go to a school that had a Division I sports program
Yeah.
because I actually wound up being an announcer for the student radio station, which is one of the
Oh,
ambitions
cool.
that I had for college, which was super
Yeah.
cool. And they gave me a great package.
Yeah.
They wanted me, which was
Yeah.
also really nice to be wanted.
Yeah. That's cool. So when you went to BC, what was your what did you go in thinking you might want to tackle in the world? Like I remember in high school, so I went to Methuen High. They had a colleges and careers class that you could take. That it was a
Mm,
block of class you could start your junior year. I remember you took a test. You take these little
yeah,
like assessments, and I remember it like I over indexed on like interpersonal skills. So therefore, like communications and it was like
yeah,
steering me down a direction. So I was like, okay, like I
yeah.
guess I'll look at Newhouse at Syracuse and the College of
Hmm.
Communication at BU. Like I too wanted to go away and and kind of catapult, away from the town I grew up in. But I really didn't know what school to pick. So I just kind of like I took those assessments. I was like, all right, I'm going to go into communications, and it worked out. It turns out the assessments were
Yeah,
helpful. I think for a lot of people,
yeah,
they may or may not, but what did it's a tricky thing, and it's a tricky thing to kind of pick. And obviously, like you get a good liberal arts education, like I did at BU, like I'm sure you did at BC. But
hmm
did you know what you wanted to do then? You mentioned you spent some time, broadcasting a bit at BC, um, and then how did that kind of lead to like the beginning of your career?
sure. Uh, I wasn't 100% sure of what I wanted to do, but I have always been very focused on policy as a way to create positive change. So
Yeah.
I was a political science major at the beginning. I added communications very quickly because I realized I loved it. I hadn't had really
Mm-hmm.
any exposure to it. And I felt like I could fuse the two together in a really interesting way to create a career. So, BC was a wonderful fit for a million reasons, one of which is it has great programs in both places. Um, I love liberal arts. I think that if you have the ability to sort of think creatively and communicate well, you're positioned to do whatever you want in your career going forward because you know how to think and things change so quickly that in
Mm-hmm.
many cases, some of the more static pieces of knowledge you gain become irrelevant in 5 years because of the change that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, well
So
said.
yeah, BC's just been a
Yeah,
great, what wound
yeah,
up being sort of the perfect fit. And then I was able to meet like so many great people, people who are still my closest friends. There's a bunch of us who wound up staying here in the Boston area. Um, but then also the ability to sort of do extracurriculars, like the broadcasting, like I was writing for the newspaper, like I was involved in some of the political clubs, all that sort of stuff really uh, started giving me some at bats on the sorts and opening my eyes up to sorts of things I could do in terms of a career.
nice. And in terms of a career, you put off a career initially, right? So you were so into policy that you went the down the law path.
Yeah.
And was that right away? Like, were you applying for law school as a senior at BC, and it was straight to UPenn?
Yeah. So I took a year off to work
Mm-hmm.
for a nonprofit arts agency down in Washington, D.C., because I sort of wanted to get my bearings.
Yeah.
I wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do next. I suspected it would involve some sort of like degree beyond my undergrad degree, but I wasn't sure what that would be. Um, One of my sort of core qualities is I'm very practical. So, as I was sitting grappling with what I thought I might want to do next, I was torn between getting a PhD in government, which I thought would be fascinating and sort of the academic study of it could be really cool, or a law degree. Um, because there, obviously, you can affect positive change. And full disclosure, I don't come from a family of lawyers, so I didn't know anything like what the job would be like when I became a lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I figured let's ultimately, it was more practical to get the JD
Mm-hmm.
because sort of going back to that sort of streak of entrepreneurship as a paperboy, I figured I could do whatever I want with a JD if I get it.
Mm-hmm.
If I get a PhD, I'm really starting to narrow myself into a
Yeah.
lane that I'm not even sure I want to be in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's that practical, pragmatic side of you. You and I are similar in that regard. I love that. So when you finished law school, what at that point, and you had that year of experience at the nonprofit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, were you like what kind of but you had elected into communications pretty quickly early on at BC, so you liked communication. So at this point, were you like, where do you find your footing, kind of like at Schwartz, or like what steps maybe happen before you end up at Schwartz and sort of, I think you end up moving out to San Francisco for a bit, um, at a pretty interesting time, kind of pre bubble burst, in the
Mm-hmm.
'90s.
Yeah, so there was a really wildly transformative, like 4-month period right after I graduated law school
Okay.
where my brother Steve, who I mentioned earlier in the pod, and I took a cross country camping trip.
Oh, nice.
This thing was a
You visit
mess.
the state parks,
National parks. So
national
I had
parks. I
never
mean,
been
yeah,
out
yeah,
west. I had never been
yeah.
out west. At that point in my life, I hadn't been west of Chicago. My brother went to school in Chicago. So
Okay.
I had this, uh, I had this like Ford Fiesta that I had bought from my manager, Roy Rogers Restaurant in Pennsylvania. I still had it. I had it
Yeah.
all through school. So I drove it out to Chicago. It literally started to die in the hills of Pennsylvania. The clutch, I don't know if you ever had a clutch. This was a stick at the time. Ever had a
No, I
clutch die
didn't
in a
know.
car? It's the worst feeling because you know exactly what's happening and you keep losing gears and you keep losing gears. And my net worth at this point was like minus some big number. And I'm literally like, my car is dying in the hills of Pennsylvania. How am I going to make it? How am I even going to make it to Chicago to keep going? Right.
Right.
So eventually I had to stop at this garage, get a new clutch put in. And then, and then we took off on our trip and it was amazing. I have always loved the outdoors. It is my favorite place to be, end of sentence. And to go out west and we did everything. We did Badlands, we did Glacier, we went into Seattle, we dropped down the coast into San Francisco, we came back through Rocky Mountain National Park. I'd never seen any of these places in my life. It was the first time
Yeah.
seeing the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah.
And, it was at that point I was like, okay, there's a lot of the world I need to see. And the second thing that happened on that trip was very transformative was I thought I could get a job as a broadcast journalist, right? So I
Hmm.
interviewed at all these cool stations in like Missoula, Montana, like these perfect places to live when you first graduate college
Were you setting up
or high school.
interviews like ahead of time and then hitting those spots in time to make the interview?
So I had one
Nice.
decent outfit in my
Yeah.
like in the back of the car,
Yeah.
and we camped virtually every time except before I had an interview. Like then we'd find a
Okay.
hotel, and I would
So you could
shower and
iron.
shave and like do my
Yeah.
thing and just come
Yeah.
marching in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so the interviews went great, and I got an offer. The problem was that like the salary wasn't even close to paying what I owed for student loans.
Yeah.
So it was just like, oh, this is not going to work. So
Yeah.
I set this up around the sort of transformative 4 to 6 month period. So I pivoted super quickly when I came back and realized, okay, I got to try and find like something that actually could at least help me pay the bills in terms of loans and stuff like that. Um,
Hmm.
and technology communications was a thing that was really starting to be a thing because technology, particularly the internet, was really starting to be a thing.
Hmm.
And it's just sounds absurd to say this now, but like there were a lot of people who thought it was like a passing fad and like just not going to be like, oh, it's a nice little niche. But one of the things I love about life in general is always learning. And one of the great things about sort of technology and now climate and climate tech is because it's evolving so much, you always have to be learning new things in
Hmm.
order to be on top of what's happening and be able to communicate it effectively. So I knew I wanted to come back to Boston. I knew that there was a lot of activity happening here. I interviewed at some of the big firms and they were very like, oh, we have this little minor practice in it. It's not really that big deal. Want to pitch dog food? I'm like, no. So in one of those interviews, I asked if they knew anyone else. And, they literally gave me this cryptic, like, I think there's something called Schwartz somewhere in Metro West. And long
Huh.
story short, a couple days later, met Stephen Paul and May Schwartz, who, as you know, were the founders of Schwartz. Before I left that the day, they had made an offer,
Mm.
which taught me something about moving quickly when you believe in something, like you
Yeah.
believe
Yeah.
it's like
The
a real. I would,
decisiveness that they had.
yeah, but
Yeah.
yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
And keep in mind where I
Yeah.
was coming from, law school, everything's slow, and talking to these big
Yeah. I've
firms, and
heard that about them, that they were very decisive. But to be good that's exhibiting good leadership.
a hundred
Yeah.
percent, a
Yeah.
hundred percent. So I was thrilled to join them.
That's cool. So you were employee 17, right? So
Yeah,
that's early. Yeah. I mean, by the time I joined, so what year was that?
that would have been '94.
94. So I joined in 2007. By then, the Boston office alone was almost 200 people.
Yeah,
It was, it was big.
is big.
So what was that like? And sort of that's you now on a path that makes you all of these things, all the experiences you've had, your education, your cross country trip, it's all contributing value to who you are now in your capacity as a partner at GreenStory.
Hmm.
But Schwartz is a particularly good place to have honed your craft. Um, and what an interesting time to be there, because I imagine the growth must have been insane.
It was crazy.
And you probably worked with like really amazing companies, and then maybe you worked with some like companies that were supposedly amazing, and then there was like nothing behind the curtain. I mean, I imagine like everything I've heard about the mid to late '90s is just that it was just wild, and it was like inevitable that something would burst and correct and the market would correct itself.
It was absolutely crazy. It was wild. Um, I got the opportunity right as I was getting married to go out to San Francisco and help set up the Schwartz San Francisco office. San Francisco, of course, in the late '90s was sort of the center of a lot of that sort of .com boomy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that was a crazy experience. That was absolutely a crazy experience. There were some great companies that were created in that time, and I had the privilege of working with some of them, like a company called Security Dynamics, which did this thing called two-factor authentication, which is the precursor to like real security. Two-factor authentication is a thing that's used today. Like I hope
Mm-hmm.
all your listeners are using that on their Google accounts, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, it was very cutting edge stuff. another company we're working with was called Macromedia, which, was eventually bought by Adobe, but they created Director, which became Final Cut, which is something that's still used today. I
Wow.
mean, so I got really lucky that some of the companies I worked with were really transformative, real sticky companies. I worked with some really bad ones too, but that's just sort of the name of the game.
Yeah.
And the, in the late 90s, to me, it was a classic case of, too many ideas and then too many half baked ideas without the infrastructure to support them. So, people make fun of companies like pets.com or, PetSmart, all those companies that popped up in the late 90s. The fundamental reality is people just weren't using e-commerce yet, and there was no way the internet could support them. But look at
Mm-hmm.
Chewy. Chewy's
Mm-hmm.
killing it. They're one
Yeah.
of the biggest consumer companies on the planet. So,
Yeah.
so much of company creation, both in technology, climate tech, any business, is just outside forces and dynamics. And did you time sort of the creation of this company at the right moment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cool. So what was it like? So the like sort of 2000s, like, well, I mean, I guess to speak a little bit, we didn't talk about this pre-pod, but I'm kind of curious, like, what was it like when the market crashed and corrected itself, the quote unquote bubble burst? And then in the aftermath was like, did you find there was more, prudent approach to due diligence from investors, and like, were there like even more impressive companies that were the ones that were kind of making it through to Series A, Series B rounds? Like, what was it like in the, early to mid 2000s?
It was so one thing about my personality is
Yeah.
I'm pretty positive and I tend to be pretty realistic as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I'm also fairly aware of like what's happening in a moment. And when you're in one
Yeah.
of those moments, it's easy to get like carried away. But I've been blessed with the discipline to sort of keep things in context and understand this is not going to be forever. And I mention that in the context because as a leader at that point, and that's sort of what I think about almost more so than like markets, um, I would always be working with my teams to say, look, this is a moment in time and it feels like it's going to be like this forever. And it's not. I'm not trying to be negative. I'm just trying to provide context.
Yeah.
So, learn in this moment and understand that
Taken
things are going to
in.
get tougher, right? And, and,
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and
Int-
experiment because you have the
yeah.
ability to experiment at this point.
Yeah.
Companies are willing to take more risk,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so every sort of like boom and bust, for lack of a better word, is different.
Mm-hmm.
Um, though, there's a thesis now that maybe we're beyond a post boom bust world. Who knows? That's a whole
Mm-hmm.
nother, you could create four
Yeah.
pods on that. But,
Yeah.
in that moment, um, it didn't feel particularly crazy. But part of that, I think, is just what we were trying to do in terms of keeping things relatively measured.
Yeah.
I also think that there tends to be, not to generalize too broadly on geography, though I feel relatively qualified because I've spent time in both places. San Francisco definitely tends to be frothier, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's bigger swings, bigger misses,
Mm-hmm.
more exuberance. We're a little more like chill here in Boston. Not chill's not the right word, actually, just like even,
Measured.
right? Measured. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
perfect word for it, right?
Yeah.
So when things get too crazy, it's like, it's okay. Like
Yeah.
we're just gonna like keep going. And when things get bad, it's like, it's okay.
Yeah.
And sometimes other places are like, the world's ending. It's like, no, the
Yeah.
world's not ending. The world
Yeah.
is not ending. There's great things that are going to happen.
Right on. What was it like, sort of making the decision to leave Schwartz and help really build Launch Squad? I remember because at that point we had met. I remember you were like one of the sort of impressive like execs. I don't know if your title at the time was, it was a VP, it was a vice president of some sort, and I think you had a lot of respect of your peers, and certainly like you had admirers that were like the youngins like myself, and and some really great talented people that I know, like good friends like, I want to say like Erica Salamita. I think that last name's now changed. Brian Kramer. Like I remember they made their way over to Launch Squad with you. People that I also loved, respected, have stayed in touch with. You went and did the thing. So was that the entrepreneur in you being like, oh, I can't turn down this opportunity? Like, did you see, was that something you sort of sought out or you felt like was missing? Because now here, this isn't your first act as like an entrepreneur and sort of like in agency and sort of consulting.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it seems like Launch Squad was like a really cool, moment for you. I'm sure it came with risk, but I'm sure it came with a lot of exuberance, to use a word that you touched on earlier. Some of that San Francisco exuberance that
Hmm.
you picked up out west.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think ambition is a good thing. And I've always been a very ambitious person. Um, and I'd gotten to my point with Schwartz where it would have been like super comfortable to just keep doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Um, but that's not really the way I'm built. And there was also transparency from the owners that they were going to be selling.
Yep.
And I knew what that meant. Like, I knew that it would mean, like, okay, all of a sudden we got to get down to the profit margin to this. And to me, a
Yeah.
lot of the joy of the
Yeah.
work then comes out.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, I don't want to play. I just don't want to do it. And I've had this wonderful run, but I want to sort of like have a more direct hand in creating something from scratch.
Cool.
So at that point, Launch Squad was only in San Francisco with a very small New York footprint and probably, I think, 25, 30 people and nothing in
Mm-hmm.
Boston.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm friends to this day with the founders of Launch Squad. They're phenomenal people. I worked with them in San Francisco when I was with Schwartz.
Mm-hmm.
And, in essence, we came up with the idea to say, hey, why don't we just open a Boston office for Launch Squad?
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, this is going to be sort of an amazing opportunity where I could bring a relative, maybe not established brand, but certainly a brand that I could like elevate tremendously in a market that didn't know anything about it,
Mm-hmm.
to a market that I felt like really needed it in that moment, where I just didn't feel like there was a tremendous amount of great options for sort of smaller, more entrepreneurial startups. Companies like Schwartz were focused on going much more upstream to these
Yep.
sort of safe revenue, big, because they're trying to get
Yeah.
their profit margins up and stuff like that,
Yeah.
right? So I saw an opening for it. Um, so we decided to go for it. And
Yeah.
it was great. The whole like entrepreneur thing where like literally renting a U-Haul, going to IKEA with, my first two employees, picking up all the stuff, building it, like just all
Nice.
that stuff, all
Yeah.
that stuff was just, finding the first clients, the whole bit. And then, finding, you mentioned Erica
Yeah.
and Brian and just
Yeah.
being the ability to just sort of put together a phenomenal team of people and build a culture that
Yeah.
was unbelievable. Just a wonderful experience.
Nice. It's a good way to start building a culture. Just like IKEA run, roll up the sleeves, get some screwdrivers out, like build things together. Get a little bit of labor always never hurt, especially for a couple old paper boys like us.
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
what was the like? Kind of give a kind of good bookend to like the Launch Squad story, like how that all went, and sort of what the I guess which is a little bit of a story of maybe the 2010s and what
Hmm.
sort of markets were starting to mature. I remember when I left Schwartz, I went over to Fama PR, and they had a
Hmm.
small little climate at the time. It was called the Green Tech practice, and I was
Hmm.
working with Suniva and learning about photovoltaic, technologies and the competition happening in the solar industry. And I was working with at the time Positive Energy that became O Power. That's the home energy
Sure.
reports we all get. Like
Hmm.
worked on that. I remembered like that, and I remember feeling good. I remember feeling good about that. I remember being like, oh, like I love these sort of these companies that are trying to do something that's going to try to kind of reduce the footprint and the
Hmm.
sort of the impact of humans on the planet. And that was early 2010. So again, not those, they weren't mature, like tons of private equity backed or late stage venture capital backed businesses.
Hmm.
And so they were type of businesses Fama was working with. Like, is
Hmm.
is it through Launch Squad and that like willingness and almost like deliberate focus on maybe companies a little bit more earlier stage, where you maybe start to, identify those companies going at climate crisis, early on, a decade ago,
Hmm.
decade plus ago, and it started to really kind of create that itch that kind of eventually crescendos with GreenStory. Am I making too
Yeah.
big of a leap there?
You're making some excellent assumptions. Um,
Thanks.
let me let me let me
Yeah.
let me
Course
start at a
correct me.
slightly
Yeah.
I'll start at a
Yeah.
slightly different point, which
Yeah.
is, now remember, policy is big in climate, right? So
Yeah.
I'm going to lead with policy here.
Yeah.
So
There we go. Yeah.
Barack Obama elected 2008.
Yeah.
There's a couple things he wants to tackle from the jump: healthcare, climate.
Yeah.
So 2008, 2009, a tremendously vibrant time for climate tech, because there was a
Mm-hmm.
tremendous amount of federal money that
Mm-hmm.
went into helping some of these hard tech stuff. And of course, MIT was very present with that.
Mm-hmm.
So at Schwartz, I actually started the first climate tech practice,
Mm-hmm.
where we were very focused on some of these like hard tech companies like biofuels and things like that.
Mm.
Um, but what
What were some of
happened,
those companies? I'm just curious.
like
I'm trying
like
to remember
uh,
the
like
names.
like a company called Joule Biotech
Okay.
was an
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
Um, so what happened was, uh, Obama made the political calculation, which I think was the right one, to sort of go all in healthcare, because he could
Mm-hmm.
barely like get it through and then move
Mm-hmm.
on. The
Mm-hmm.
problem is, like, healthcare was harder than his team thought it would be. They
Mm-hmm.
squeaked it through, and then the 2010 midterms came, and he lost the House and the Senate.
He lost his juice. Yeah.
And this is
Yeah.
what happens with a lot of first term presidents. Like, you
Mm-hmm.
lose,
You
you
got to
get
pick.
2 years to get your
Yeah.
stuff done. So what
Yeah.
that means for climate and climate tech, boom, right?
Yep.
All of a sudden, the government is putting less money into it. The
Yeah.
VCs are like, whoa, 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 I'm not going to take this kind of risk. And the
Yeah.
technology wasn't there yet, right? Think
Mm-hmm.
about all the technology advances we've seen since 2010 to now.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
crazy. It's absolutely
Yep.
crazy. So with that kind of context, when I came into Launch Squad, I knew that I wanted climate to be an important part of our portfolio, but I
Yeah.
also understood that some of the deeper tech stuff wasn't really going to be appropriate at this time. And a lot of the innovation in that period is going to happen more in the sort of the consumer and business to business front. So you mentioned O-Power, which is a company actually that Launch Squad worked with, I think probably after, uh,
After. Yeah.
after. And
Like
as
through
you
the
know, they're
Oracle.
very,
Did you work with them through that Oracle acquisition?
yeah,
Yeah.
yep,
Nice.
yep.
Yeah.
So as
Yeah.
you know, they're basically a B2B like company, right? That
Yeah.
was focused on energy. So
Yep.
sort of like one step over from a known technology. The big
Yeah.
consumer example, of course, is Tesla, where
Yep.
it's like 2012, 2013, when they introduced the Model S, and they start to become a viable like company.
Mm-hmm.
So when you sort of look at that time frame, what I would call like 2010 to almost like 2015, 16, the
Yeah.
innovation sort of happening in the B2B world and the consumer world. And it wasn't until like relatively recently that some of the deeper tech stuff now has started to get some of this funding from the government side. But now the venture capital community is more comfortable investing, because the actual technology has gotten to the point where it's viable in a shorter sort of time frame to come to market.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then also, like, the market is demanding it, right? Solar at this point is a commodity. Solar is
Yeah.
the number one way that energy is created in the world.
Mm-hmm.
End sentence, right? Like, so it's very safe to go into solar. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, in some ways, VCs are like, solar's too safe. There's no innovation
Yeah.
left.
Yeah. That's it. That's really interesting. So I'm curious, like before just putting a bookend on the launch squad, like were you able, like were you a partner in Launch Squad? And because you were, and if you were, and given the sort of small, more nimble kind of role you were playing with earlier stage companies, like do you start playing a bit with cash and equity splits? You were able to start getting kind of some interesting like positions and options and deferring some cash to help earn some sweat equity, put some sweat equity into these businesses. Like, is that, I've seen that increasingly, certainly, for myself, that's one of the things I realized in the mid 2010s was like
Yeah.
the value in like maybe being more open and willing to sort of align longer term, get some skin in the game, and then create a little lottery ticket for down the road if things worked out, But
Yeah.
it created good founder alignment.
Sure.
Um, Deals like that, are those kind of deals that you started getting involved in, or do you get involved in even now with GreenStory?
It's case by case. So
Yeah.
with Launch Squad, job one, pay your people,
Yep.
give your people raises, treat them well.
Yeah.
Like, period. Right.
Yeah.
So when you look at your revenue, you got to make sure you've got that and you're comfortable. And you also have like enough buffer if things go sideways. For
Yep.
instance, when COVID hit and all of a sudden there was what wound up in retrospect to be a very small amount of time, but everything
Mm-hmm.
went sideways. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So you
Yeah.
have to have all that. I almost feel like now I'm talking about personal financial planning, right? So then,
That's
because there's some
yeah.
parallels, right? You got to make sure that that's all done.
But that's the life of an
So
entrepreneur. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but it's interesting because there are different degrees of entrepreneur, and I don't know
Yeah.
if you'd agree with this, Zach,
Yeah.
but like I
Yeah.
could never be like an all-in entrepreneur. And what I mean by that
Yeah.
is there was a moment with after I left Schwartz when Carolyn and I had two little kids that I could have like started my own company,
Yeah.
but I wasn't quite willing to take that risk with family as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
just myself, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm always going to have that sort of mindset with
Mm-hmm.
then the team. So in this case, coming back to sort of like how you balance it all, um, if after that's all done, you feel like, okay, here's a really interesting company. And I think lottery ticket is the right way to think about it
Mm-hmm.
because like your listeners know that most startups fail.
Yeah.
So in the vast
Yeah.
majority of cases, you're probably not going to get paid,
Mm-hmm.
right?
In the
So
vast majority of my cases, I have not been paid. But
right,
the
that's what happens.
the exception is to get paid and to get paid less than you would have anticipated getting for the cash that you deferred,
Right.
which
So
is. But it's always
yeah,
an interesting. It's a worthwhile like thing to share because it's knowledge is power, and I just didn't. It's
totally.
you don't know that that's a potential path, and it's for younger people. We have a lot of younger listeners. It's like
Yeah.
those are the types of things you should be asking for. If some, if you want to discount your time, fine, but try to at least get a lottery ticket.
Yep.
Can't hurt to ask. Because
Yep.
when I was younger, I had plenty of impacts on exits that I wish I had
Yeah.
like asked when I was putting in more time
Absolutely.
than need be,
Absolutely.
or that at least contractually stated I should.
Yeah.
Um, cool. So when did your launch squad sort of tenure end, and like what was the break or gap between that and sort of starting GreenStory? I remember seeing I caught something on LinkedIn. Like I feel like as you mentioned earlier, like we're similar. Like spent a lot of time outside nature. I spent the first couple hours of my day today like doing some calls, but like outside, foot on sand at the beach down here in
It's
Beverly,
awesome.
Mass. Like, um, did you go into a state of reflection? Like what was, and then how did you arrive at sort of the thesis for GreenStory, or like, how did you kind of band together with Megan for GreenStory?
Yeah. So, one of the things Carolyn, my life
Yeah.
partner, and I have
Yeah.
always talked about, even pre-kids, is there are going to be certain moments in our life, if we're lucky and privileged enough to have these moments, where we should sort of reassess things and just take a look and make sure everything's going the way we would like it to go.
Mm-hmm.
So 21, 22, we started to hit one of those marks where our youngest was going to be heading to college.
Yep.
So we just literally would go on bike rides and go on talks and say, hey, how do we think things are going? Like, do we want to stay in Concord? At the time, I'm obviously working full time with Launch Squad. Carolyn has got her own business going um, around sort of mental health. And we agreed that it was like time to switch. And what I mean by that was I was very I wanted to sort of figure out what my next step would be, and I needed some sort of clarity and space to do it. I couldn't decide. I mean, you know what it's like when you're working like in an agency setting and there's so many
Yeah.
things going on, you just can't, even if you're going for those sweet 2 hour walks on the
Yeah.
beach, it's really hard to fully like
Yeah.
make some good decisions.
Yeah.
Um, so we said, okay, I'm going to take a sabbatical.
Yeah.
So we, both Carolyn and I love the outdoors, as I've said multiple times, and we love to travel. So we took a number of great trips. We went out to Europe and hiked the Tour de Mont Blanc, which is, maybe the world's most iconic trek, where it's 2 weeks around the Mount Blanc Massif, which goes through 3 different countries.
Nice.
Switzerland, Italy, France. You have like the Sound of Music like stuff where you come over a mountain pass and then you're in a new country. It's so cool.
That's cool.
It's great. We went to Hawaii. We went camping in California. We just did a lot of different things. And during that time, I'd never done anything like this in my life. And the ability to just sort of like disengage and then just like have everything start to set was really restorative. And then I was able to start thinking about what could be next. Um, and I really felt like and feel like we mentioned at the beginning of the pod, that we're in this really cool moment for climate where there is now enough awareness and movement that we need to do something now. And there's a lot of help needed across every piece of everything. And as individuals, if climate is something that motivates you, you have the opportunity to sit and think, where can I help? And then you could create a career out of it, which is
Mm.
something I talk to my kids about all the time and younger people who I mentor. Like, to me, there are parallels between where climate is today and where the internet was in the mid 90s. I really feel like there's some parallels. Um, and, if you're thinking, if you're in your career, it doesn't matter what part of your career, but certainly if you're in a younger part of your career and you're not thinking about climate or perhaps AI as like something that you really want to get into, you should probably rethink things, because those
Mm.
are going to be places that are going to be growing tremendously, and you would have the ability to make a real impact.
That's great. I love that. That's gonna talk about a nice little highlight for listeners. Folks will be seeing that in their LinkedIn feed in
Excellent.
the next couple of weeks. You hit on a couple things there, and interestingly enough, like I actually, I'm looking at some of the pre podcast stuff we covered, and I want to give you an opportunity to speak a little bit more, just general, like, policy things that are happening right now, or factors to, it's an election year, things that people might want to be aware of, as if they should be aware of anything, like heading into the voting booth. I know it's a little early, but it's right around the corner. And yeah, just like sort of what, generally speaking, like what, you're a positive guy, we're both positive guys, like what are you most excited about trend wise? Maybe there's trend, whether it's policy or trends or types of innovations that, are underway or on the near horizon, that if they go in the way that they seem to be heading, we're all, we should all buckle up and perhaps try to create those careers, in and around areas positively impacting the climate crisis.
I'll start with what I'm most excited about,
Mm-hmm.
which is the fact that every day more and more people decide to build their professional lives around climate. That is amazing. Because what we're doing is we are getting like the best minds and the hardest workers and the people who care the most. We're getting their talents helping solve, maybe the biggest problem that we face.
Mm-hmm.
And that's great. Um, Policy is one of these things that is always going to be great or not great. And I think one thing that is easy to do is to focus so much on the federal piece
Mm.
that we forget a lot of the innovation And a lot of the things that are happening at the state and local levels.
State and then up. Yeah.
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 So, in
Yeah.
terms of like living in Massachusetts,
Mm-hmm.
we're the best. We have all
Yeah.
kinds of great policies in place, right?
Yeah.
And we have always been a state that has been at the leading edge of these issues.
Mm-hmm.
And in many ways, we can become a, a an example for other
Mm-hmm.
states and the federal government and even other countries
Mm-hmm.
to like basically mock up against. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Governor Healy has been super aggressive about leaning into the innovation piece and creating. She just announced her administration $1 billion that's going to go into funding sort of hard tech, climate tech companies and
Mm-hmm.
sort of building that ecosystem. But
Mm-hmm.
just as importantly, um, sometimes we focus too much exclusively on like the founders and the science PhD. This is everyone is getting involved, right? So if you think about manufacturing, if you think about construction, what's happening is there are clean technologies that are being integrated into all of those things, and those are jobs that require a high school degree at most,
Mm-hmm.
maybe a couple years of community college. And Governor Healy has been really good at um, not just acknowledging that, but then putting some policies in place to fund that kind of work, and then connecting some of these larger companies, like for instance, Form Energy, um, with the sort of talent base that they need across all levels to help them grow.
Mm. That's cool. Thanks for sharing all that. And the last question I want to hit on with you, I feel like if listeners have been tuning in closely, they could almost guess the answer because of based on what you did, taking your sabbatical and where you tend to go and what you tend not to be around when you're doing your best thinking.
Yeah.
But what's your challenge for listeners, for readers?
Yeah. So this is something I started doing a number of years ago, and I'm so happy I do it. I spend the first hour of my day awake with no screens. And it is amazingly like liberating. I'm one of these people who wake up and I find my brain is pretty active. So the ability to just start writing things down and stare out the window at the birds and maybe go for a walk or just do something that doesn't involve a screen. And I'm so committed to this. I actually bought an old school like alarm clock so that I don't have to use my phone as an alarm, right? And we,
That's
we
awesome.
actually have a no phones in the bedroom rule. We just keep them
Yeah.
out. And it just, to me, when the hour's up, I mean, sometimes I just keep going and not
Yeah.
using it, but I feel like when I get online, I'm online on my terms and I'm in
Yep.
the right mindset and I've already accomplished some things. Uh, so I would highly recommend your listeners try it. And if it feels too daunting to do it every day, like try it on the weekends to start,
Yeah.
right? But just sort of walk into it a little bit. And then it's one of these things where once you start to experience it, you'll be like, oh, okay, this is cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Few things to relate on that. One, I have an Apple Watch. In part, I got the LTE watch because when I go outside on a hike or a run to work out,
Mm-hmm.
I don't like to take my phone.
Yeah. Yeah.
I like to strip myself of my phone, and my wife would appreciate it if I could we could contact each other in an emergency. So I got my
Mm-hmm.
LTE Apple
Yeah.
Watch for that
That's
reason.
great.
Um, and we do, yeah, like no phones at dinner is huge. One
Mm-hmm.
thing, I've become a phone bowl guy, especially after COVID. I don't know if you
Mm-hmm.
realize, if you noticed this, but we were all doing so much doom scrolling on our phones during COVID.
Mm-hmm.
We started getting back together with friends, like maybe it was late 20,
Mm-hmm.
early, 2021. And I remember it was one day we were at our best friend's house. There was probably 7 or 8 adults. There's like 3 children. And I looked around and 6 of the 8 adults are on their phones.
Wow.
And I was at my friend's house and I was like, can
Yeah.
I have a bowl? And she's like, what are you doing, Zachary? She's known me forever. So she calls me Zachary. I'm like, I'm creating a phone bowl. And I
Nice.
went around and I was like, does anyone have like an emergency going on in their family or any reason why they need to be texting anyone? Like, is that no? Okay, great. Everyone put your phone in here. Like,
I
and
love it,
also like
Zach.
we're around our kids right now. Our kids are like, at the time they're,
Yep.
3, 4 years old. Like, come on.
Hmm.
Like, what are we teaching them? We're all hanging out in the
Yeah.
flesh and we're on our
Yeah.
phones. So a
Hmm.
huge pet peeve of mine is when friends come together and are on their phones.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
so just bust out the phone bowl.
I love it, Zach. That's great.
Mike, this has been a pleasure.
It's all mine. This has been so fun catching up. So fun.
Yeah. This is a great productive way for us entrepreneurs and dads to catch up. I'm looking forward
Absolutely.
to sharing this with the community and when we take it offline and get this out get this out to market. Looking forward to hearing more and please don't hesitate to reach out if as I look forward to learning more about the great companies that GreenStory finds, identifies, and helps share the story of publicly.
That sounds great. That sounds
Yeah,
great. Thanks so much.
cool. All right, cheers.
All
Cheers,
right.
Boston.
All right. Take care.